Hi, so if you're looking to install an air source heat pump, I wanted to talk a little bit about a few things that you might want to consider first. Things that are often overlooked, particularly when the government is currently announcing lots of grants being available for air source heat pumps. So for air source heat pumps to work at their best, you are going to need to do a lot of things to your property if they are not already in place that will make them efficient. So it's not a solution that works for everybody, even though that's not kind of explicitly made clear when the government talks about it. So one of the things that you probably need to think about first is upgrading the fabric of your building. And by that, I mean, most of the houses in the UK, they're not currently insulated to a significant level. Anything pre-1990s is likely to be problematic. So you would need to upgrade the insulation to the property. Now, there are different ways to do that. If you are cavity construction, so sort of post-1930s build, you can do what we call foam fill insulation in between the cavity. Doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't have the most thermally efficient way of insulating a building. Or you can upgrade insulation from the inside. So that's putting insulation on your internal walls to upgrade the insulation. Or you can do it from the outside under permitted development, but that can alter the way that your house looks. So you often see these houses now that have got sort of thicker walls on the outside with a render face next to another property that slightly steps back, and that's particularly around because they've put insulation on the outside. The downside of doing that is you're likely to have to change your gutters at the top of the roof, and all sorts of different things sort of fall into play. So it's not just a case of upgrading your to an air source heat pump. If the fabric and the thermal insulation properties of the house aren't sufficient to start with, that is going to have a detrimental impact as to how efficiently the air source heat pump works. One thing to also be mindful of is because we're so used to central heating in the conventional sense and hot air and heat coming out in the way that we're used to, air source heat pump requires a different way of treating central heating. So that's just something to be wary of. It's not going to work in the same way that conventional central heating does. And you will get slight peaks and troughs, particularly when it's very cold. And you want to make sure that in order for it to work at its best and to be suitable for your property, that you have upgraded the insulation to the whole building. If you have any single glazing, then that probably needs to be upgraded, because double glazing also improves the thermal efficiency of your building. So that's the fabric first kind of process. The other aspect to think about is you may need planning permission. Now, air source heat pumps are allowed under permitted development, subject to a lot of criteria being met. And I'm not going to go through all the criteria here because there is lots of stuff online where you can check that. But principally, your air source heat pump has to be at least a meter away from the boundary for it to be compliant with permitted development. That's not always going to be the case because you're going to want to put it discreetly somewhere in the garden on the side, quite often next to a neighbouring fence, and therefore it might require planning permission. Now, from a planning perspective, with an air source heat pump, it's not that they won't necessarily give you permission. They may ask for some acoustic data or some acoustic screening around the pump so that it is not disturbing the neighbours. And there is, as I said, lots of other criteria that need to be met with an air source heat pump for it to be classed as permitted development. So if you're not sure, check with the suppliers and check if you need planning permission, because you may need some assistance with that. The third and probably final point to kind of raise in relation to sort of air source heat pumps is around the electricity that is being used to kind of drive the pump. Your electrical provider, so sort of national grid base level, rather than your sort of energy provider, which would be kind of Octopus Energy or British Gas, they essentially need to confirm that you have enough incoming electrical supply to power the air source heat pump. And this is a little bit similar to sort of electric car charger units. An application needs to be made to them, and it's called a DNS application. Often the provider does this, but if not, you may need to do it yourself, or you may need to engage a specialist to do this. But that needs to be checked before you can have an air source heat pump commissioned and be eligible for the grant. So the two things are tied together. So you're not eligible for the grant until you've had the DNS paperwork approved. The process for the DNS can take a long time. Historically, when the grants were made available around air source heat pumps, we found that the application process for the DNS with the provider was taking so long that people weren't then becoming eligible for the grant because they're time capped. So just be wary about those things. Make sure an application is made as soon as you know that you want an air source heat pump, because that will impact whether or not you'll be eligible for the grant. So hopefully those 3 tips are useful. We'll be doing a little bit more videos in the going forward about air source heat pumps, because they are kind of becoming a little bit more mainstream and people are considering them. But until you've considered the fabric first, and whether you need planning permission and the electrical side of things, just be wary that it might not be a solution that works for you.